Good afternoon to the entire Millsaps family. This is Nathan Shrader. I'm the chairman of the Millsaps College Department of Government and Politics and director of American Studies. And we've got a special treat for you today. We're coming to you live from the Jackson Institution CSs, where many of you have probably spent a lot of time during your days at Millsaps. We wanted to help you relive that by bringing you this discussion with some of our student leaders about the presidential election that's coming up in just a few weeks. So today you'll be hearing from some of the most highly involved students on Millsaps campus about their involvement in this election season, but also some of their thoughts as the people voting in a presidential election for the very first time. I don't think anybody here is voting for the very first time, but this will certainly be their very first presidential election, as I still remember what that was like voting in mine. So let me go around quickly and introduce everybody. We'll start over on the end. Emma Cabanero is a senior political science, still a political science major, because our department changed names after she declared her major, and economics double major. Did I get that right?
No, business admin, but close
business
enough.
Admin. and she is the president of the Millsaps College Young Democrats chapter. Fletcher Freeman from Fairhope, Alabama, is the chairman of the Mississippi Federation of College Republicans, also very active in the College Republicans organization here at Millsaps, and a major in government and politics. And Andrew Devall from New Orleans, Louisiana, is a major in government and politics, but he is also our campus democracy fellow through the Common Cause organization out of Washington and co-sponsored by the Mississippi chapter of Common Cause. Thank you to all of you for being here at CS's to talk politics with our esteemed alumni.
No better place to do it.
Exactly.
Feels like a normal Friday.
Well, look, what I want to start out just asking you in general. Look, I voted in my first presidential election 20 years ago in the Al Gore-George Bush election, and I'll always remember what that felt like voting in your very first presidential election. Is that you all have voted in previous elections? Does this one have a different feel to it for you heading into a presidential election?
I think personally I'm more excited just because, you vote in every other election, but I think a presidential election just has a little bit of specialty to it. Like you said, you still remember your first one. So I'm excited to look back in 20 years and say, I talked about it at CS's with some friends before.
Right.
Just compared to other elections, yes, it's special, but I mean, just in terms of the presidential election, not that your vote doesn't count as much in the presidential election, but the local elections in previous years have still been very exciting to me, just because I felt like, especially in the governor's election, and then in different House of Representatives elections, that your vote's meaning a little more, so it felt like that I was really contributing to our democracy.
So fortunately, this is my second presidential election. I turned 18 2 days before the 2016 election. Yeah, so I lucked out. So it's interesting seeing that dynamic versus just voting for the first time and then working for presidential campaigns and things of that nature.
Yeah, and we're going to circle back to that point about why students or voters in your age group may be less likely to participate in some of the local elections. We're going to come back to that point too. But I wanted to also ask you, what is it, why did you all decide, you're all from outside of Mississippi. Tell us, where are you from, but also why did you decide to register to vote locally here in Jackson? Because all of you are registered Mississippi voters.
So for me, I'm from New Orleans, and so one of the biggest things that I thought was that I'm going to be here for at least the next 4 years and maybe longer. So I just thought that my voice, especially in local elections, I wanted to make an impact during that, because it's just going to impact my life more being at Millsaps than back in New Orleans.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Originally from Fairhope, Alabama, so when I moved here, Millsaps was doing voter registration, so I immediately signed up to vote in Mississippi. Knowing that I was going to work in Mississippi, it was best for me to immediately start voting here because that's where my tax dollars are going.
Yep.
And I can't say I can say anything other than what they've said. I'm from Tennessee, and I just realized that I was going to be here for a while, so I wanted to see my vote impact where I was going to be living.
I really just didn't want to drive home 2.5 hours to go vote, or just like try and navigate the troubles of absentee voting. So that's another main reason why I signed up.
And I want to just take a moment to explain to the folks watching this that one of the things that has made our Millsaps Votes project so successful over the last 5 years is that we take advantage of federal law and state law, which allows students, as long as they live on a college campus as residents, can choose to register to vote either where their families live or where they go to college. They can't, of course, register in 2 places, but they can choose to register at school, and that reduces the time that it might take for them to drive home to vote. It might reduce all the burdens associated with absentee voting. So we found that has been a really important mechanism for improving voter turnout among our students. I do want to say, and this was, I think, slightly before you all arrived here at Millsaps, we tracked our voter performance in the last presidential election 4 years ago. It was before you got here, of Millsaps voters, registered student voters, and I believe that 85% of our students who were registered at Millsaps in the last presidential election turned out, which was significantly higher than the city of Jackson's turnout average and the state itself. So we've shown that students are more likely to vote when they're registered here locally where they go to school. And I guess now might be a good time before we get into the presidential election. I do want to talk about the local piece of this. Do you see some advantage, given that none of you are from Jackson, but do you think that being registered to vote here in Jackson has made you feel more like a member of the Jackson community than maybe because now you have to pay attention to certain issues or things happening in city government that you might have not have really noticed before, because now you get a vote on it?
Yeah, definitely for me. And also just like Jackson is still it's still the capital city, but it's still one of those like small southern towns where everyone does know everyone. And so you'll kind of be talking to someone whenever you're at about upcoming election, and it might be a local one, and you mention someone's name. It's like, oh yeah, like his brother goes to the country club that I work at. Talking about Brenna Michael, So it's really everyone knows everyone, and you feel like you are definitely more involved when you are voting here, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. I think an important part of being registered to vote where you go to college is investing in your community. And I think being registered in Mississippi kind of forced me to be more invested in my community and pay attention to what was going on, which helped make Jackson feel more like home.
I think one of the cool things is not only is we are invested in the community, the candidates themselves are extremely invested in us.
Right.
So we have them come on campus and introduce themselves and talk about their policies and initiatives and ideas versus just kind of ignoring that college vote.
Yeah.
So it's great to see candidates come on campus and talk to us versus just kind of ignoring the idea of college kids voting.
And I really think one of the lessons that we've taken away from our Millsaps Votes initiative was that if we build up enough registered voters on Millsaps campus, it's hard for candidates to ignore Millsaps, that they're going to physically show up at Millsaps. They're going to come across the street and ask for your votes. And that's pretty cool to see that. Because if we only had a handful of students registered, they might overlook the college as part of their constituency. And back in the last mayoral election in 2017, there were about 10 candidates running for mayor. We through our state and local politics class, at the department at the time, we invited all of them to come and have a 3-minute speech to give to interested students. Well, we had about 220 people show up that night to hear those candidates, and we had all the candidates arrive expecting just a small college crowd, and they walk into a room with 200 some potential voters. That shows that, first of all, you all care about this, but also it tells them they can't ignore the issues that are important to you. So no, I think what you're telling me here is exactly right. It's kind of what we were hoping to see, but I actually think that this came along a lot faster. I think I was expecting this to take several election cycles to build up, but we had candidates in the last election, when we had state elections last year, calling us saying, when can we schedule time to come speak in the Leggett living room? And we ended up doing that before the runoff election last year. But that is a testament, I think, to the fact that we do have maybe a more politically or civically engaged student body than maybe other institutions, to our credit. Now, thinking about the presidential election itself, what have you found to be which issues in particular, maybe do you find that other students like yourselves, including yourselves, are talking about the most, are motivated to vote by the most? Is there a certain issue or set of issues that are driving people in your shoes this year at Millsaps?
I think one of the biggest, and this has been kind of recent, is just Supreme Court confirmation coming up. You're voting on justice, even though confirmation hearings are kind of already underway. I think that's been one of the bigger things, especially on the Democratic side, that has really excited the base a lot. So,
yeah, from the Republican standpoint, it is fun kind of sitting back and watching the Supreme Court be talked about quite frequently, because it's an extremely crucial piece of democracy. And so watching not only one but two different justices go through hearings at my time at Millsaps has been very interesting, getting those different opinions from students.
Right.
I think one of the things we're talking about the most right now in Young Democrats is just the handling of the pandemic and the hopes that, the outcome of the election gives us a different outcome to our pandemic. Obviously, we're talking about all of the issues on the table, but I feel like most frequently that's been a lot of what our conversation has been based around, just because it's so relevant to everyone on campus. I think we're all ready to be done with Zoom University.
Now, do you all think that people, again, in the 18, we'll just call it the roughly 18 to 22-year-old age group that might be voting right now at Millsaps, are voters in that group thinking more about the pandemic in terms of the economic issues surrounding it, the public health issues, or something else? Is there another component of this that you all, when you're on campus talking to each other and in the caf or in the living room or in your residence, how does this come up in conversation as it applies to politics, if it does?
the one way it comes out is, hey man, like, what are you doing tonight? It's like, nothing. I can't really go out because we're in the middle of the pandemic. So I think that's one of the big, and then the conversation will kind of switch from there. And then most students at this point have either had it themselves or had a family member who's had it. So, and some students have even had like parents lose jobs because of it. So I think public health reason, and then also economic for sure.
I think they're looking at both of those factors and then kind of taking it personal with the amount that this has affected their lives and just the entire world at this point in time. Yeah. So they're looking at it from a personal view, which has been interesting to look at because you hear about this economic crisis that we're going through with families that are losing their jobs and people that are losing their family members to this virus. Yeah. So.
Most definitely. And I know my friends, I don't know about you, being a senior, facing this economic crisis and the thought of graduating and maybe not having that job lined up because of the pandemic is definitely scary. And I think definitely something we all talk about or at least think about quite frequently.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the importance of all this is that it shows that you all are looking at this and people like you are looking at this from a multifaceted viewpoint. It's not simply about public health. It's not simply about the economy. It's about your lives in general and the people around you. And one thing I can say, being a professor at Millsaps, is I've been extremely satisfied with the seriousness that students bring to the table in terms of the way in the classroom they treat the health protocols, the discussions we've had about the pandemic and all these tangential issues that come along with it. So I don't know if that's what's happening in other colleges across the country, but that's been my impression that students here are taking this very seriously, and I think that shows. But what do you think, outside of COVID, are there any, and we've talked about the Supreme Court, heck, we've had several in classes, several opportunities to cover Supreme Court vacancies now in the last few years. Emma mentioned the job market, and I don't want to, for the two seniors here, I don't want to make this about a job search stress, but what are you all anticipating when you graduate? Are you expecting the economy to rebound by the time that you're graduating from Millsaps here in May, or do you?
That's the hope.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we can cross our fingers.
Okay.
I'm going to grad school, so I'm putting that off for a couple more years.
Yeah, deciding not to go to grad school or continue my education, it's been extremely crucial for me to kind of lock down ideas of what I'm going to do after college right now.
Yeah.
And fortunately, through connections I've made at Millsaps, it's made it easier.
Good.
But I couldn't imagine going to a different school and being far behind and saying, okay, I got to go find a job after I graduate now.
Right.
Most definitely. I think, you know, in deciding to go to law school, it's definitely, like Andrew said, we've got a little bit of a safety net in that we're going to continue our education, but it's still very much the, you know, can we one day pay off those student loans, you know?
Right. Right. And so that brings me to the actual choices you have in this presidential race. And what is your, first of all, as I like to do in class, I like to separate out talking about the personality of politicians and candidates from their actual positions. So let's start with the personalities. What do you see as strengths and weaknesses of these Joe Biden and Donald J. Trump as the two major party nominees from just your shoes as a voter, two of the three of you having voted? This will be your first presidential race, but in general, takeaways on character, personality traits, things of that nature. What do you think?
Just right off the bat, I think one thing that Joe Biden has over Donald Trump is the ability to show empathy. Time and time again, he's come out and empathized with those who have lost loved ones, who have lost family members in war. And then on the flip side, you have Donald Trump, who really hasn't publicly empathized with any of the victims of the pandemic. So that's those are two polar opposites right there, and I think that's a strength for Biden and a complete weakness for Trump.
I think something that is a little bit the reverse side of that is that Trump's this overwhelming power. So it's confidence. It's a confidence when he's up on stage. People feel very confident that he knows what he's talking about and what he's doing when he's on stage, and the Republican base is extremely excited about that versus the kind of shaky feeling that some Democrats can get when Joe Biden's sitting there talking.
Yeah, so I think for me, it is the quiet leadership that Joe Biden offers to his people that is more appealing to me. Just the overwhelming personality is a little much for me. And I think I'm able to, like Andrew said, relate to Biden a little bit more because he is able to empathize with people and kind of shows that quiet leadership, which I feel like our country needs right now.
Well, one last thing kind of on that's more of a personal or personality trait issue with the candidates. If we look back at this election season, you said that Donald Trump had very little opposition for the Republican nomination, but Donald Trump's 74, almost 75 years old. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden is currently he was 76, I believe, during many of the primary contests, and Bernie Sanders was the second place Democratic candidate at 77, 78 years old. But he was back. The younger voters tended to be his engine, right, of support. Does this surprise you at all that some of or do you feel disconnected from the fact that the top three candidates were all in their mid to late 70s? That one of the people most likely to be elected president of the United States this election cycle, they were going to be 74, 75 and up. Was that alarming to you? Was that something that you thought about when you were evaluating candidates, or is that being overblown kind of in the news media about this age question?
I think it's overblown, and I think just on the Democratic side, you kind of have the party shifting towards a more progressive feel, and that doesn't mean a young versus old thing. I think it's more of like, when did you come into politics, and that, especially like for Elizabeth Warren, she kind of became a national figure after Barack Obama was elected. And all of those kind of national Democratic figures after Obama was elected in 2008 tend to be more progressive instead of kind of the older style of Democrats. So I don't think age is that much of an issue. And I think also Joe Biden sees himself as more of a transformation, like a transitional candidate to more of a progressive Democratic.
And he did say that right before the convention, that he viewed himself as a bridge, I guess, generationally. So you're not, for you personally, you didn't see the age as a disconnect from you, given the gap between your age and theirs.
No, not at all, really.
Okay. So I mean, I agree. I think it's extremely overblown when it comes to the news. I think what speaks volumes is a great example is Bernie Sanders' campaign, who was staffed and volunteered by mostly young voters from 18 to that 25-year-old bracket. So you've got this massive generation that's getting behind one candidate in the Democratic Party. And so when it comes to now the two candidates, which will be whoever is elected, the oldest president that's ever been elected in the United States, there's that confidence behind him with the group, because not only were we extremely involved during the primaries, we're extremely involved now. So we have confidence in that candidate we put forward.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think if you're able to appeal to your constituents, then age shouldn't be of the concern.
Yeah.
I think it's just what we're dealing with right now. So
Right. And I have been asked that question by reporters too, about why are younger voters so accepting of these older candidates? And you mentioned Elizabeth Warren was in the next tier of Democratic candidates. Elizabeth Warren, I believe, was nearly 70. Michael Bloomberg was in that primary. He was in his mid 70s, late 70s as well. And the way I kind of described it to me was, we all think of the way people your age, and even mine, I'm a little older than you are, but like there's this veneration of our grandparents and their generation. And, I think that that prevents this kind of hostility on the age question. But let's talk for a few minutes about Mississippi politics, because unlike, I think, the traditional college students that are out there, you all have been very engaged in Mississippi politics, which is, given our proximity at Millsaps to the Capitol, to City Hall, to the party headquarters, to all these things, that's a real benefit. And we have a couple of important elections on the ballot here this year. A United States Senate race that the polls show that it's tightening. We have two amendments, constitutional amendments, one to approve or disapprove the new state flag design, which is being called the In God We Trust Magnolia flag. And then we also have the medical marijuana initiative. We're competing 65 and 65A. Have you all been following these races? What do you think people, again, I hate asking you to speak for everyone in your age group, but the people at Millsaps who think and talk about politics, where do you think their heads are on these races that affect Mississippi?
So I guess I'll start off again, but just for the Senate race, I don't think people are generally looking at the polls. I think in conversations I've had, it's more about the sheer amount of money Mike Espy has been raising over the past couple of weeks now. And he's kind of came into a couple of more national, PACs, like the Get Mitch or Die Trying Fund. He's been added to that. And then also the Lincoln Project has added him as one of their donors. And those are two big things. And for me, seeing that, people nationally think he can win. So those people aren't going to invest their resources into him if they don't think he can win. So that's kind of more how I'm gauging it. And but it's just going to be a tough race overall, because Cindy Hyde-Smith, one, is an incumbent. It's hard to beat an incumbent in Mississippi. It's just a very red state. Yeah,
for the first time since Reconstruction, we have 8 statewide officials that are all Republican. So right now the Republican Party is kind of strong in Mississippi. So this is actually going to be an extremely interesting race to watch, because it's going to gauge how tight of a hold the Republican Party does have on Mississippi. Mm-hmm. The state flag's coming up. I think that was a very bipartisan thing that took place. It's time to get a flag that everybody can get behind. There was a lot of different designs. There's 293 designs that were submitted, and we leveled it down to this one. I really haven't heard much on it. I don't think people have really seen the official design, and I think they'll see it on the ballot, and it'll be kind of that last second decision for them.
Yeah, I would agree. I think right now in the Young Democrats, we're just trying to show our support for Mike Espy and educate people on what his policies are. Like Andrew said, the more successful he's being, I think the more involved people are willing to get in his campaign for sure, just because they know that they're going to back someone who has a pretty decent chance of winning.
And I'm just also based off of Mike Espy, even if he doesn't win, there's some different counties that Jim Hood won and was kind of turning purple. And it'll be interesting to see if those stay purple or stay blue, such as Madison and DeSoto, to see what those wind out. And then also, even if he doesn't win, I think he is setting up a future for Democrats as a whole in Mississippi, which is exciting for students just to stay here. because he's creating a massive voter database, which will make it easier for candidates running in the future, for sure.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting to see. Not only did he run last time and unfortunately come up with that loss for him, but running this time, you kind of wonder what his motives are. But moving forward, he's that light and shining armor for the Democratic Party right now, and that's extremely needed for them. So it's interesting to look at that.
Most definitely. I think his campaign is paving a way for the future, and I think it's exciting for students who are at Millsaps who are Democrats to see that they are in a place where, a Democratic candidate can be successful and run a really successful campaign.
Yeah, and the one issue that has dominated the Senate race in the last couple of days, we'll talk about how Mike Espy's caught up in terms of fundraising, but also that we're not having any debates. Do you all think that students who are voting for, again, maybe for the first time in a U.S. Senate race, or in a close Senate race, would it be helpful if we had like a U.S. Senate debate in Mississippi, or even right across the street from us at Millsaps that host Mike Espy and Cindy Hyde-Smith, the U.S. Senate debate?
I don't think it hurts Cindy Hyde-Smith really, but I think it hurts Mike Espy in a chance that could be for him, just to get his name more out there, get people more excited who are Democrats.
The lack of.
Yeah, the lack of the debate not being there right now for Mike Espy, it's really hurting him because he's just missing out on a chance to excite the base, especially when you can't really hold the same kind of events that a campaign's used to. And you didn't have the big fair this year, so it's a premier chance for those candidates to speak at, and they just missed out on that.
Neshoba County.
In the Neshoba County Fair, so they missed out on that big platform. And so now a debate, I think, would really help him, but I think Cindy Hyde-Smith, I think it's smart for her to not debate him, honestly.
Yeah.
College Republicans last cycle threw all statewide Republican debates for those that were being primaried. So I think it's extremely crucial to sit back and have a debate, but I think you're exactly right. It only hurts Mike Espy if there's not one. So I think there's going to be an avoidance by it, which tends to happen in politics. You don't try to do what's going to shoot you in the foot.
Yeah, for myself, I just think about when we were able to welcome those candidates to campus. I guess it was our freshman year, and how important that was for me to feel like I was involved in the Mississippi political scene. I think if we were able to do that for our freshmen and sophomores or whoever just registered to vote for the first time, I think that would be a really pivotal point in getting them involved in politics here.
Yeah, just kind of pivoting back to that earlier, when we did have people on campus, that was how I got my first job working in campaigning, was we had some candidates come and speak, and I really liked one of the candidates, and I went and talked to him after, and I had a summer job right there. Okay. So I think that's one benefit to Millsaps.
Mississippi politics just kept me gainfully employed in my Millsaps.
So there is one thing I think I can say as a non-Mississippi native too, is that sometimes Mississippi politics has gives off this impression that it's a very walled off and closed process. I don't think that's not been my experience here in the six and a half years I've been at Millsaps. I don't think, and we have 3 students here who are all from outside of Mississippi, and I don't think that's been your experience either. Why do you think there's that impression? Because that was the impression when I first moved here. I was told by others, oh, that's not a place where you'll be able to get very involved in things because you're not from there. I've had the exact opposite experience, and sounds like you have too.
Mississippi is old politics. It is stump speeches that they're giving at Neshoba County Fair. So a lot of people look at this old politics way of just as not involving those people that are not from that area that we don't understand. But I think it's good to come back to Mississippi and look at just how old things are done here when it comes to, like I said earlier, Neshoba County Fair. It's interesting watching these candidates get up and just talk to large crowds in the middle of a fair. Or you've got the Jackson Fair that's coming, is here now, that the candidates will be walking around talking to people, giving elbow bumps because of COVID, not shaking hands, but still being out there personable.
Yeah, that was never my experience here, feeling like I couldn't get involved. That's actually how I ended up being a political science major, is because I kind of found a community to jump into immediately. So honestly, I don't think it could have been further from the
Right. And I do think that's something that we have shown with our student engagement in politics at Millsaps, is that Mississippi politics is wide open for people to get involved in. And I guess that's my last question for you about the election. Is we didn't talk about the medical marijuana initiative. Do you think that the fact that Mississippi is a state that has lagged behind others with regards to even medical marijuana, this initiative or amendment rather doesn't legalize or decriminalize marijuana or allow for taxation and recreational use like we see in other states? This is simply a medical marijuana initiative. Is this still something that may motivate student voters to go out and vote, or is this something that they're talking about?
I don't think it's going to be like the reason why they're going to vote, but I think people kind of see it as a stepping stone and just a kind of bridge to eventually what's to come.
Yeah.
And so that's I don't think anyone's going out to vote just because it's like, oh, I'm going to go fake my back injury and get my card and now I can smoke pot on campus. But I think people like will vote yes for it. So
the biggest push to the polls is obviously going to be the presidential election.
Yeah.
I mean, you tend to lose voters as you go down the ticket. And when you look at Secretary of State's website of where this initiative is actually placed on the ballot, it's at the very bottom. So I'm interested to see the engagement in presidential elections versus this initiative.
Oh, the initiatives they'll all be at the end of the ballot. You're
Very
exactly
end.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think going off what they said, if it was happening at a different time, I can see it potentially being more of a pull, but I don't think that's really any of our focuses right now. Not really why we're going to the polls, to say the least.
Right. And I guess one of the last things I'd like to ask you to weigh in on is Mississippi certainly has, I think, an accurate reputation of being a state where voting is not the most easy or accessible as compared to other states in the country. What do you think Mississippi could do to make voting access easier or more accessible to people in all age groups, but primarily maybe thinking about those voters in your age group?
So I also interned for the Democratic Party's voter protection unit this summer, and one of the things working with them is not needing a notary for your absentee or mail-in ballot form when you request it. I think that would be a huge step. And then also, like a ton of precincts have closed across the state, especially in poorer areas, which is just making it harder to vote in person in general. So I think those are two of the biggest things is have more precincts and then just make it easier to vote absentee.
I think personally, I've been in contact with the state chair of College Democrats, and we are working with State Senator David Blunt on just kind of giving our opinions so that when he meets as the chair of the Elections Commission, he can sit down and kind of have this discussion of college students aren't finding it easy to vote, and this is an extremely crucial generation that needs to vote because we're that next step. We're the leaders that have to take over.
I agree 100%. I think having more places to vote would make it much more accessible. And also the issue of the notary. I know we were discussing in our first meeting the other night, our student who is choosing to drive, what did he say, 6.5 hours?
6.5 hours.
Instead of trying to go through the struggle of getting an absentee ballot.
Yeah.
And I think that's a stark example of the reality that students are left with.
Yeah, we do have a Millsap student who feels so passionately about voting in this election. The student is registered here on campus, but is learning remotely this semester. In this particular case, the student is in Olive Branch, and the student is going to drive here and back simply to go cast their vote because they feel more confidence in that than the absentee voting process and the rigors of that. So that I do think says a lot about
Most definitely.
what you all are talking about.
And even voting in person has been a struggle for some Millsap students. In the past, we've gone to the polls and we haven't been on the registry.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Exactly.
That was a huge issue for us last time. I remember we were on the group of people who were receiving calls,
Yes.
one of the numbers of if you're having trouble, call us. And we received quite a few phone calls.
Yeah, we did have the November 2019 general election. Millsap students were, for some reason, omitted. For newly registered Millsap students were being omitted from the precinct books. and we had to actually call Channel 12 News, and they were the ones that got to the bottom of it for us, because we could not find out why our students who we know registered couldn't vote, and are being told they weren't able to vote. But there are things that I think you've all suggested that would be good ways to move us forward on this. I guess the last question I have for you, just to wrap up, is what message would you all have, maybe if not for future government and politics students, but the students who are involved in politics on and off campus at Millsaps aren't just in our department. They cut across all majors and academic disciplines. Let's say there's an incoming freshman that walks in the door right now and wants to ask you all, the veterans of Millsaps politics, like, how do I get involved? What do you recommend that I do? What would your advice be for them, or for future Millsaps students?
For future, this is one for getting involved in politics, but just also getting involved in Millsaps. Just invest yourself in the Millsaps community and in Jackson, because I guarantee you're going to run into a student who has a good connection or a professor who has a good connection, and they will be able to point you in the right direction. And if you show that you're invested in the city of Jackson, it's going to pay off for you in the future.
I know Emma and I, our freshman year, we had candidates on campus all the time. So even if you wanted to avoid politics, you'd walk in the Leggett and they're right there.
Right.
So being able to meet these candidates, you're seeing that, like we said earlier, they care for us. They care what we're thinking. So, I mean, you can get involved that way. Even if you're not the government politics major that is your plan, the art major can get involved, because you run into a candidate you may truly believe in, right in the middle of campus.
Most definitely. I would say just show up. I think, like Fletcher said, we've got so many candidates coming to campus in previous years, and also we have just so many clubs and organizations. No matter what your party affiliation, you're going to find a group of people who you feel supported by. And I think in that way, that's the easiest open door to get further involved. Most definitely.
Yeah, and I certainly think that once we're safely past the COVID-19 time period, we'll be able to get back to it. We can, again, safely have candidates come back to campus and visit campus again, because that has been something that's felt like it's missing this year, is that element of we've still been able to register voters, students, and we're going to be getting them out to vote, but it hasn't quite had that same feeling to it just because of safety reasons. But I'm looking forward to us getting back to that. Look, I want to, first of all, thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to watch this. We always appreciate hearing from Millsaps College alumni, and we are planning on doing more work through our department to get to check in with our government and politics and political science alumni in the coming years. But I also know that you've just heard from three of the most highly involved people I know in politics, and they're all ready to vote in this election, and they've been trying to get all of their peers and friends ready to vote in this election. So thank you very much for watching. And on behalf of Emma, Fletcher, and Andrew, I want to say thank you and go Majors. Hello, Millsaps College family, friends, and alumni. My name is Dr. Nathan Shrader, and I'm the chair of the Department of Government and Politics, formerly the Department of Political Science for many of you, here at Millsaps College. We're coming to you from the hub of political activity in Jackson, the venerable CS's, home of the best burger in Mississippi. We'd like to take a moment to thank Mr. Pat Bolin and his entire team here at CS's for allowing us to invade or take over his establishment and his bar for this afternoon. And we hope that it brings back some memories for you of your time at Millsaps as a major. And we do promise to leave enough beer for the rest of you and his regular customers once we're done. Every single day, I have the pleasure of doing something special, talking to, learning from, learning with, and teaching some of the most talented young people on the planet here at Millsaps. In the Department of Government and Politics, we believe that students are best prepared for their lives and their careers by studying politics from an applied standpoint. How and why do things happen the way they do? It's where we challenge our students to balance the concepts of realism and idealism to look at politics from all vantage points and from all perspectives, from the actors and stakeholders in the political process in every type of imaginable political situation. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the 2020 presidential election, which you probably know we're in the midst of right now. Particularly, I'd like to focus on our nation's obsession with predicting winners and losers in these presidential races. Just a heads up before we get started, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the candidates, the issues, or the strategies that these campaigns are employing, because we would need an entire semester to cover all that. In fact, I'm teaching a semester-long course that meets for 3 hours every Wednesday night that occasionally goes over the 3-hour time limit, just simply called American Presidential Elections, that does just that and examines those things. So I'm going to set those aside for now. Allow me to open up today with a few important questions. Why do we make predictions? What advantage does this give us? Why do we even care about predicting the outcome of presidential elections? Chances are, if you're like me, you've probably spent most of the summer and fall hearing experts and pundits, journalists, and fuming Facebook commentators, such as your red hat wearing MAGA uncle or your lefty Bernie-crat friends from junior high school, making predictions about who's going to win the 2020 presidential election. As of this morning, Nate Silver's popular 538.com is giving Joe Biden, former vice president and senator from Delaware, about an 83% chance of winning in November on the 3rd. However, it ought to be noted that on the morning of the November 16th presidential election, this very same source, Nate Silver's 538, was giving Hillary Rodham Clinton a 71.4% chance of winning the presidency. So you can take that or leave it for what it's worth. Let me tell you a quick story as it relates to predictions, specifically these statistical predictions. I was in the WJTV CBS News studio here in Jackson on election night 2016. I was scrambling to piece together an explanation and a narrative of what was happening in front of us for a live television audience here in Jackson. Meanwhile, in the control room, I was watching the feeds of the national TV news networks. And who comes on but Nate Silver himself, who earlier that morning projected a Hillary Clinton victory at 71.4% likelihood. Here, Donald Trump is quickly overtaking Hillary Clinton and is on his way to be the next president of the United States. While I and others around the country were scrambling for explanations and narratives in real time on live television, there was Nate Silver on live TV revising his predictions downward as results were coming in. I kid you not. It's the equivalent of a Vegas bookie changing the odds of a football game at the 2-minute warning in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl. Sheer nonsense. It's not how we do things in reality when it comes to politics. Let me flash back one more time to 9 years ago. I was at an academic conference in the state of New Hampshire, which took place in the fall before the 2012 presidential primaries. And it was right when that process was really getting underway. The candidates were spending more time there. The news media was camped out in the state. And I had the opportunity to hear one of the great speakers of that region in political science. One of the speakers on a panel that afternoon was Professor Garrison Nelson of the University of Vermont, who truly is a sage of the pageant of American politics. And very few people understand politics the way Professor Garrison Nelson does. During his talk, Professor Nelson pointed out some of the absurd ways that we can predict the likely winners and losers in that next year's election. His main purpose was to say that we can have all the models we want, we can have all the formal predictions that we want, but at the end of the day, the voters are still going to do what they do, and we have to be able to explain what that is. His talk that day inspired me to go back and dig deeper into some non-traditional indicators that may help us foresee the future of this election season. Remember, I'm Nate Shrader, not Nate Silver, so some of the things I'm going to tell you are certainly not of the Nate Silver school of political forecasting and prognosticating. Several of these predictive models were brought to my attention way back in 2008 when Barack Obama and John McCain were running against each other, when a blogger named Sam Greenspan highlighted a few of these online on his blog, and it was picked up later on by Time magazine. So follow along with some of the slides that I'm going to be showing you that helps to illustrate some maybe unconventional or abnormal models of predicting the outcome of this presidential election. A professional football team known as the Boston Braves moved to Washington in the year 1936 and were renamed the Redskins. As you may know, they are now the team with no name, and as many football fans would say, the team with no chance of winning the NFC. Although at 1-4 right now, they're still in the hunt in a tremendously weak division, including the 0-5 Giants, the subpar Eagles, and the Prescott-less Dallas Cowboys. In 17 of the 20 presidential elections held since the team's move to Washington in 1936, if the Redskins, or whatever we're going to call them now, win their last home game before the election, the party that won the previous election wins the next election. Confused? I am too, so let me back up. If the Washington football team wins their last home game before the election, the party that won the previous election wins the next election. If you're trying to keep score at home, that's good news for Donald Trump. If the Washington football franchise without a name loses that game, the challenging party's candidate wins. That's good news for Uncle Joe. The only exceptions included Obama's win in 2012 over Mitt Romney and when Al Gore won the popular vote, but not the presidency in 2000. There's also a hitch in the 2016 data because 2016, of course, complicated everything in the way we look at politics. Since the Redskins did lose, you would think the model might work, but they played the Cincinnati Bungles in London, where they were officially listed as the home team, but didn't actually play at home. So you can take or leave this model too for whatever it's worth, that the Redskins played a home game in which they weren't home overseas. But once again, 2020 throws us a curveball, which is perfect for what we've come to expect in the last 4 years. The Washington football team, believe it or not, is on a bye week, the weekend before the November 3rd election. What was Roger Goodell thinking when he, by throwing a wrench into this delicate, intricate, scientifically sound model that we were all going to rely on? This year, we'll have to put the Redskins rule, as they used to call it, but now I don't know what it's going to be called, to the test, as that team is actually scheduled to play the Dallas Cowboys at home, but on October the 25th, the last Washington home game before Election Day. So just to recap, not to make it any more confusing than it already is, on Saturday, October the 25th, Democrats should be rooting for Dallas. Republicans should be rooting for the team with no name. Sticking with the predictive sports models, let's turn to the NBA. Believe it or not, the Los Angeles Lakers have competed for the NBA championship in 10 presidential election years, winning 6 times and losing 4. That's an awful lot of championship runs just during presidential election years. As you know, the Lakers won the NBA championship over the weekend, which should excite those who support the Donald. Taking a look at the chart I made last night and is on your screen now, in the previous presidential election years in which the Lakers appeared in, it's not that they won or lost, but simply appeared in the NBA Finals, the Republican nominee won 7 of these, while the Democrats won just once, in 2008 with President Obama. The Republicans have actually won 8 of these if you're looking at the Electoral College vote, if you count the disputed 2000 election in their column. So it could be football or it could be basketball, but there are other models that we can look at that may be slightly less scientific, but certainly more fun and amusing for us as we consider the complications of this election year. Now let's talk about coffee. Even though I don't touch this stuff, we need to consider it for a minute. 7-Eleven customers predicted the winner of 4 consecutive presidential elections. That's right, 7-Eleven customers predicted the winner of 4 consecutive presidential elections. For 5 straight elections, the 7-Eleven franchise, or the chain rather, sold paper coffee cups in the weeks prior to the election with the major parties' candidates' names on them. And what they would do across all 7-Eleven franchises that participated, they would tally up the total sales with the winners of the 2000, 2004, 2008, and 2012 elections based on the Electoral College, also winning the sales races. But there's 2 important notes to consider. First, 7-Eleven produced a separate uncommitted cup in 2016 and replace the candidate labels with Democrat or Republican. So, as far as I can tell, unfortunately, final sales results were never released. But with a week before the 2016 election, uncommitted led both the Democrat and Republican cups with 40% of those purchased. A second note, the company's website makes no mention of whether there will be a 2020 presidential coffee cup contest, nor have they distributed a press release on the subject based on their own media archives. It could be that this election year is simply too controversial for 7-Eleven to want their customers to wade in. Perhaps they didn't want to go through producing cups with Biden and Trump on them or Democrat or Republican on them, or perhaps they didn't want to make any new cups at all to save a little money. But if they do decide to reignite the cup contest, it seems as if, just based on my Google Maps app, that the nearest 7-Eleven franchise seems to be conveniently or inconveniently located at 100A West Highway 80 in Forney, Texas, a mere 390 miles from our campus. It could be worth the drive if you're really interested in this election, but I can't guarantee that they actually have the cups available. Whether you want to make that drive is up to you. Just don't miss class for it if you want to go out and do it. Next up, what's in a name? Going back to the 1900 presidential election between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, the candidate with more letters in their last name has triumphed in 15 contests, while the candidate with the shorter last name has triumphed in 10. This is legitimate academic research, and I double-checked it on my own. I'm not a mathematician, but by my count, this renders the 2020 race that we're all about to vote in a true toss-up. Trump, 5 letters. Biden, 5 letters. I guess we're gonna have to find another indicator to determine where we are in this race. Moving along with another unexpected predictive model, starting in 1992, the magazine Family Circle conducted, and again, I'm not making this up, this is all too real, a quote unquote First Lady Cookie Bake-Off, with the wives or spouses of the candidates submitting their favorite cookie recipes to Family Circle magazine. Once again, to clarify, I'm not joking, this actually happened. Even more astonishing is that the outcome of the Cookie Bake-Off correctly predicted 6 of 7 elections since the competition began. That's right, the Family Circle magazine First Lady Cookie Bake-Off predicted 6 of 7. I like those odds better than Nate Silver's or better than any prognosticator that we've heard from so far. But what was that sole exception? Well, it came in 2008 when Cindy McCain's oatmeal butterscotch cookies outpaced Michelle Obama's apparently low-energy shortbread cookies, leaving the McCains with a cookie bake-off victory that did not translate into a presidential election win that year. It gets more interesting. It really does. Time magazine actually reported in 2008 that Mrs. McCain was accused of stealing her recipe from someone else and passing it off as her own. I'm not sure if this was comparable to Donald Trump's wife stealing lines from Michelle Obama's convention speech, but it certainly received considerably less press coverage in 2008. One other important footnote here. In 2016, former President Bill Clinton's famous, again, I'm not making this up, famous Clinton family chocolate chip cookie soundly defeated Melania Trump's sour cream-laden sugar cookie for yet one of these results where it just simply doesn't line up with the outcome. Sadly, we're not going to be able to use this metric either for this year because the publication Family Circle appears to have folded in the year 2017. So we'll lose out on this very valuable metric for the Biden-Trump election. But one can only imagine what delicious cookie recipes would have been in store for this year. How about this for a metric? Perhaps we should just allow the grade school kids to choose the president because they've come pretty darn close in the past. Some of you may remember from your own school days a publication known as the Scholastic News. Well, every 4 years, the Scholastic News runs a presidential election poll for grade school kids. And this dates back to 1940. They've been doing this for that long. They have correctly predicted, the kids that is, have correctly predicted 17 of the past 20 presidential elections. Those are really good odds that they're gonna get it right. But when did they get it wrong? I had to go back and check this. But interestingly, they picked Thomas Dewey in 1948, Richard Nixon in 1960, and Hillary Clinton in 2020. Obviously, the Chicago Tribune wasn't the only publication that was noteworthy enough to declare that Dewey beats Truman in 48. Then the kids again get it right. The Weekly Reader poll, another publication you might have been getting during your school days as a grade school student, they picked the winner between 1956 and 2008, 13 out of 14 times. But sadly, despite their outstanding prognostication record, 13 of 14 correct races, they went out of publication in 2012 before the Obama-Romney race. So what was their only botched prediction or misprediction? 1992's election. One more to consider. Nickelodeon runs something called a Kids Pick the President poll. They've picked the correct winner 5 of 7 times. And the only years that they were off were in 2004 when they predicted that John Kerry would defeat W, and in 2016 when they predicted that Hillary would defeat Donald Trump. Let's move on to something that's a little more seasonal in nature. Since this year's election isn't scary enough already, we turn to the most tested, trusted, and scientifically accurate indicator known to man, pundit and politician alike. It is the Halloween mask sale metric. An article by journalist Luis Gomez in the Baltimore Sun on October the 25th, 2016, took a deep dive into this predictive model. Gomez unearthed a press release by the Spirit Halloween Company, which was issued from their headquarters in beautiful Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. I've been there for vacation. It really is beautiful. And in that press release, they declared that the Spirit of Halloween Mask Index, they actually have a name for this, the Spirit of Halloween Presidential Mask Index, quote, has accurately predicted the outcome of every presidential election since 1996 based on their top-selling candidate mask. Despite what the pundits had to say in advance of the 2016 election, mask sales again trumped the polls, accurately forecasting a Donald Trump victory based on tremendously big mask sales. Additionally, Thrillist blogger Dustin Nelson wrote on October the 23rd, 2016, that since 1980, the candidates whose masks have outsold the other nationwide at all Halloween stores has won 100% of all presidential elections. Unfortunately, I've not been able to actually confirm a data source that matches up with his projection. But if he's right, check out your mask sales right after Halloween. I suppose this means that I won't be ready to make any kind of official prediction on this election until final sales numbers are available the morning of November the 1st, just a few days before the election. Finally, based on the success of these models, I decided to take a stab at what I hope to call the Shrader groundhog model for predicting presidential election outcomes. As a native of southwestern Pennsylvania, I grew up just 90 minutes from the famed town of Punxsutawney in beautiful Jefferson County, Pennsylvania. You may recognize it from the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. During the last election cycle in 2016, I started thinking about whether the predictions of the meteorological master Punxsutawney Phil may correlate with election outcomes. If so, I may have a best-selling book on my hands, or at least so that's what I thought. Unfortunately, the Shrader groundhog model failed to see its shadow. The table I created that you see on your screen shows that Phil has predicted a long winner in 91% of the 32 presidential election years going back to 1900, and an early spring just 9%, or 3 of those years in the past 120 that also featured a presidential election. Perhaps not all is lost with the Shrader groundhog model. In both 1988 and 2016, Phil predicted an early spring. And the Republican nominees, George H.W. Bush and Donald J. Trump, won the White House. Phil once again predicted an early spring this year. I guess we'll soon find out if a pattern is emerging from Gobbler's Knob that's good news for Republicans everywhere. Now, with all that said, you can probably tell that this political scientist is not a fan of the predictive nature of our field that is in vogue right now. As someone who has years of hands-on political experience, working on and running political campaigns prior to entering academia, I become suspicious when pundits and academics seek out a model to predict voter behavior when in fact, we need to allow the voters to do what they do, perform their patriotic duty, and vote. The real challenge for people like me, and for any effective political scientist really, is to be able to accurately and fully explain what happened and why, not engage in fun yet unhelpful prediction parlor games. In closing, I want to leave you with my own list of what to watch for in the coming weeks before this election that can help you and I both best explain whatever happens and why. On this slide, I'll show you the few things that, again, without too deep of an explanation, I would recommend that you watch for in the news and in any analysis that you conduct on your own of this election. First of all, this election is going to be decided by turnout, not persuasion. This is a turnout election, which means whichever side turns out a more enthusiastic and a larger share of their own party base is going to win. There's something that has gone undetected in the 2016 elections. In the 2016 election, we heard a lot about Republicans changing from Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton and Democrats changing from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. That's actually not statistically accurate. To be honest with you, about 90% of Democrats in the 2016 election voted for the Democratic nominee. On the other hand, about 90% of Republicans voted for the Republican Party nominee. These patterns I don't expect to change very much, but what will happen is in 2016, the Republicans were much more enthused about turning out their base for Donald Trump than the Democratic base was for turning out for Clinton. Therefore, it's about turnout, not persuasion. It's not about persuading new voters to change their mind. It's about turning them out for their party. This actually perhaps more closely resembles elections of the late 1800s than what we've become accustomed to in the last 50 years in the United States. The next thing that I would ask you to watch for is the impact of COVID-19 as a policy issue. And that because it affects economic policy thinking, education policy, and public health. But also, I'd encourage you to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the process. It's changing the way we vote. Millions of more Americans will be voting early in person, early by mail, early absentee in all these different states using places like mailboxes and drop boxes that we may not be used to seeing. So COVID-19 is inadvertently impacting the process. That might make it easier to vote and to have your vote counted. The next thing is to watch out for the accessibility of voting. We happen to live in a state here in Mississippi where the accessibility of voting is very poor compared to that of other states. It's very difficult for citizens to handle and properly fill out and complete their absentee ballots. It requires a notary that they often have to pay to have notarized their ballot before they can get mailed in. There are other states that are way ahead in terms of accessibility of voting. So be careful when you're looking at election results to think, in this state, how accessible was it to get your ballot counted or get it to the polling place? And then the last two things would be the suburbs. As you might hear, Donald Trump battling on Twitter for the suburbs, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris doing the same thing in their specific policy proposals. And then the last thing would be for this. I'd ask you to keep in mind that the voters, like you, and not the professional prognosticators and pundits, are going to decide the outcome of this election and all of the congressional elections that happen in the country on November the 3rd. And I would say this to be careful, because we may not know the winner of this election on election night, which is not something we're necessarily used to. So we're going to have to be patient, and we're going to have to let this process play out. Because as I said earlier, so many states are conducting elections differently this time because of COVID-19. In conclusion, I would be remiss if I didn't give you a homework assignment to be done before November the 3rd. Even though I'm a skeptic when it comes to predictions and prognostications, there's one individual who has developed a model that has withstood the test of time, and it seems to be fascinating and accurate all at once. Perhaps you've heard of Dr. Alan J. Lichtman. He's the American University history professor and author who's correctly predicted every single presidential election since he started doing this in 1984. Lichtman's 2 books, The Keys to the White House and Predicting the Next President, that came out this year, neatly lay out his 13-key system, again, that has withstood the test of time and has far more depth than what we just see looking at simple numbers alone. In August, Lichtman released his much-awaited forecast using his 13-key model, the same model he's applied to every race since '84. You can find a short video from the New York Times with Lichtman explaining how his system works and how he is applying it to this election by following the link on the bottom of this slide that's on your screen right now. It's worth listening to Dr. Lichtman for a few minutes because Dr. Lichtman does something that the other prognostications don't do, provides a great deal of depth and understanding of politics and history that you don't always get from looking at polling data. In the end, I'd love to hear your feedback on what you see and hear from Lichtman, as well as what you've heard from me today. Please contact me with your thoughts. My email address is on your screen at nathan.shrader@millsaps.edu. I'd like to hear if there are any of these models that I may have missed that you and your friends and family are aware of, and what you think in general about the Lichtman keys, and whether you think they're convincing. Thank you very much to Millsaps for allowing me the time to talk to you today. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Pat Boland and CS's for allowing us to be here in the nerve center of Jackson politics at his bar and restaurant. And thank you so much, and please go vote on November the 3rd.